Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology.
Hello, Noble Mind listeners. We are here today to talk about the fourth noble truth. And if you haven't yet listened to our first 3 episodes looking at the first noble truth, the second noble truth, and the third noble truth, have a listen to those ahead of time, or feel free to just dive into the deep end with us today. I will just briefly remind you that the first noble truth, in a very basic sense, is this idea that life is characterized by suffering, struggle, unsatisfactoriness, challenge, that having difficulties is an inherent part of being a human being. And the second noble truth is that suffering, struggle, challenge, unsatisfactoriness comes from wanting things to be other than they are. Traditionally, it's translated as being caused by desire, in the sense of wanting things that are good to stick around forever, desiring what feels pleasurable, desiring to avoid what is painful, and being driven by that sense of desire. And the third noble truth tells us that there's a way out of all this struggle, that there is hope for us yet to find a way towards peace, to find a way towards some kind of equanimity, and that liberation is possible. And these noble truths, including the one we'll be talking about today, all exist within a Buddhist framework. And so we're talking about these kind of dipping in a little bit to some of the more traditional Buddhist dimensions of it, but also thinking about ways that even non-Buddhist people or secular people can pick up some of these ideas and find them helpful in their lives. But I think it's important for some of these for us to remember, and we'll be sort of, as we have been doing, we'll be bringing up places where actually it's really important to remember, like the view of reincarnation or the view of karma or some of these other assumptions that are made that some of these truths are resting upon. Whether you believe in them or not, they're an important piece when we're thinking about how we interpret these teachings. And with that said, let's dive in to the Eightfold Path, the fourth noble truth that says there is a way out of this suffering, and it is the noble Eightfold Path.
The good news about the fourth noble truth is that we're given 8 spokes of the wheel, 8 elements of the noble Eightfold Path. So initially, we have been told the truth about what makes us unhappy and its causes. And now we are being encouraged and given a method for how to bring about change. It's curious that the fourth noble truth actually then points us towards the noble Eightfold Path.
Yeah, it feels a little bit like there's all this buildup. Noble Truth 1, Noble Truth 2, Noble Truth 3, liberation is possible. How do you do that? Noble Truth 4, all these 8 other things over here. You know, it feels a little bit like a pivot, bait and switch kind of thing. Like you've been building me up to this fourth one, and now the fourth one is actually 8 things. So like, okay, we could have started there. I mean, we need to know the view of the first 3 to get to the fourth, but I've always felt like it feels like a little bit of a pivot or a twist here, that like we get to number 4, but like surprise, it's actually 8. Right. So, and then we could dive as deeply into each of these or deeper than we've done at the first 3. So maybe we'll go into these in more depths in future episodes as well. But today we'll hit the overview of the Eightfold Path.
It is a little bit like, just as we are being told the answer, it turns out like we have to buy the encyclopedia version.
Right. Yeah. Well, if you want to get the true answer, you have to pay $99 a month, and then we'll give you the real juice. And then the 8th of the Eightfold Path is actually the next. No, it isn't. It's just, but yeah, it does feel a little bit like we thought we were getting something with number 4 that would be nice and pithy and simple, but actually there's, another 8 directions for us to look. So thinking about the Eightfold Path, maybe it's helpful to think that there are eight, as Alex said, like spokes on a wheel. It's often called a path, but it's not linear. It's meant to be sort of eight directions for us to move in, or skills or capacities to cultivate as part of walking our path in the world. Not that you do one, check it off, and then the next, and check it off, and so on.
They seem to support each other, and maybe it's a spiral process, perhaps. That's not like we complete one and check it off and I move on to number two.
Right. Yeah. Would it be helpful for us to maybe describe the three sections? Buddhism loves their lists, their numbered lists, and their categories within categories. And it can be helpful, particularly if you're listening like to a podcast, to kind of mentally don't feel like you have to try to remember all eight, but also to know that the eight break down into three categories.
Which helps with remembering. And I think originally the reason why these are all numbered lists is because people for centuries memorized the teachings. This is a capacity that people had apparently in cultures all around the world. Actually, we are capable of memorizing hundreds of pages of material, even though we don't do that in the modern world. So the three sections are wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. Under wisdom come right view and right intention. Under ethical conduct come right speech, right action, and right livelihood. And under mental discipline come right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. They're also translated as wise. So in other words, wise view, wise intention, and so on.
Yeah, that's important, I think, because when modern Western ears hear right, we hear right versus wrong, good versus bad, being pious and pure and good and right and righteous. There's that sort of set of associations with that word. And that's not always super helpful in this context, or maybe in many contexts. But so, yeah, it is good for us to remember that the word right here is connoting more like virtuous or wise, coming from certain understanding. And this is part of where that Buddhist worldview fits in, like a right view, and we'll get into this in a moment, or a wise view is that which is kind of grounded in the sort of Buddhist view of emptiness, compassion, karma, reincarnation, some of these foundational principles. So just when you hear right, as we're talking, remember that, as we've said before in other episodes around these themes, that traditionally that talking about a specific view of the tenets of the Buddhist worldview.
And the sense is that they are less commandments never to break.
Right.
And more guidelines to live according to, and guidelines that can help us align our lives with the truth of how things really are, with the truth of how we're constructed as biological beings, our neurobiology. If you just look at the scientific view of it, about extending that into multiple lifetimes and other realms that as yet we can have an open mind about.
Yeah, it's a good place to notice our own cultural context and our own, whether it's secular assumptions like around science or our own kind of religious training that might make us hear these as commandments or something, and just to kind of be curious about that and maybe open about noticing our tendency to go to those places when interpreting something that kind of was developed outside of both of those frames, for example. So the first two, shall we dive in? The first two are right view and right intention. So as I was just jumping the gun a little bit a minute ago, I mentioned right view as being connected to this Buddhist worldview, this view of impermanence, interdependence, compassion, emptiness, as I was already saying, sense of multiple lives and karma, and possibility of liberation from the cycle of rebirth, and the importance of utilizing our time during this lifetime to try to improve our conditions for future lives, and some of the other stuff that's kind of foundational wisdom in the traditional Buddhist way of thinking. So that's a very brief way of thinking about right view in a sort of traditional sense. But we could also think about right view in a less like in a more secular kind of application, or like what can I find helpful in this for my own everyday life if I'm not necessarily a practicing Buddhist, but maybe, being thoughtful about the ways in which our own distorted thinking or illusions of how the world is maybe in our day-to-day life isn't quite accurate.
And it's interesting because the right view, it's not purely conceptual, but it's an embodied understanding that people develop over the course of practice. Also, the idea is that these are all ideas to be tested in one's own experience. They're not handed down by a supernatural being and just to be followed and not questioned at all. They're more like people who have practiced and thought about this a lot and studied this have concluded these things and see how they check out in your own experience. In fact, that's the only attitude that can really help us to realize it. It's a different sort of understanding of faith.
We could also think about right view maybe in terms of its opposite, like a wrong view or an unhelpful view might be one that's like very self-focused and ego-driven. So like a very dualistic and selfishly motivated approach to life would not necessarily be coming from a place of right view. Like right view is more about dissolving the sense of self and other, right? Having more of a sense of the interdependence and interconnection. So softening that tendency we have every day to get caught up selfing, right? Like being Kate or Alex, separate from the rest of the world. And then making all of our decisions in terms of what benefits this individual self here. That can also be a very limited and unhelpful view.
Yes, it's interesting to note that selfing is actually created by the default mode network in the brain. And even though we may at times think that that's the truth of things, it turns out that our brains have all these different networks. And for instance, when we are attending to sensory experience, such as when we're taking a walk in the woods, we're turning that mode off. And what we're experiencing is what they're talking about, selflessness, essentially. And they're positing that this is a fiction, that a unitary being. So it's worth exploring. And a big piece of right view also is what's wholesome and unwholesome in one's experience. So, for instance, Buddhism teaches, like many other traditions, that ill will is unwholesome. So the idea is like practice ill will or let it play out in your mind, see what kind of results that gives. Practice these wholesome things, goodwill or loving kindness towards yourself and others, and see what sort of thoughts, mind states, actions that leads to.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a really nice segue into our second of the Noble Eightfold Path, which is right intention, because the right intention in a large part is that intention to benefit all beings, the intention to renounce the ego and let go of attachment, and to have this positive intent to be of benefit in the world to others. So it's this cultivation of loving kindness and compassion. And it's kind of hiding under this phrase, right intention. But there's a lot of, if anyone's done Tonglen practice, and, a lot of that is connected to this right intention, right? To sort of be of service, to be of benefit.
Right. So not harming, benefiting oneself and others, not being wasteful, and also intention of renunciation, which is also a very nuanced concept.
And kind of a loaded word, I think, at least in a kind of Judeo-Christian
Right.
sort of concept. So what could that mean? Like relinquishing of attachment, or letting go of ego, clinging to all we love, and running from all we find unpleasant or difficult would be maybe another way of thinking, like renouncing that way of relating to the world.
Right. I've heard it referred to as renouncing the causes of suffering almost.
Yeah.
So things that appear like they will lead to happiness, but they don't. So it's not asceticism. It's more developing a fine understanding, embodied understanding of what leads to true happiness or deeper happiness.
These first two of the view and the intention kind of do create a way of relating to the world, a way of seeing, a way of sort of thinking and feeling, coming from a not usually the place most of us come from in our day-to-day mind state, right? We're often in a very narrow view, serving the self rather than others, clinging and cultivating attachment and separateness and having a sense of permanence and all of that. And then the next three, which are the ethical conduct domain, we don't have to do this linearly, but they do sort of grow from the roots of this right view and right intention. So it's like, oh, okay, so like, but then how do we do that? Okay, I've got the view, I've got the intention, but then like, how does that manifest? And the next three get us into a little bit more of like how that actually might show up in our life. And so these are right speech, right action, right livelihood.
Right speech is really interesting. I think there are several different versions of criteria for what constitutes right speech.
It's not always saying nice things.
Right, right. One that I have found useful in my own life contains 5 conditions, I suppose.
Is there another list here?
Get another list. Every time you click on something.
Another list pops up.
Like a Russian doll.
Yeah, I'll click on it. Tell me the 5. These are 5 related to right speech.
The version I have found useful contains the following ideas. Spoken at the right time, spoken in truth, spoken affectionately, spoken beneficially, and spoken with a mind of goodwill.
Mm. Boy, would the world be different if we all did that all the time.
Yes. I found this useful in terms of like writing an email where I feel upset about some product.
Right. Like right speech is not telling it like it is in a very like harsh, direct sort of way. Right. It's speaking with compassion, goodwill, these things that you've listed. Wonderful.
Right. A previous version of me thought, well, this is really how I see it. So if I have to be true to myself, I need to tell them this.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So part of right speech is also not speech, right? Is knowing when to speak and when not to speak, when to refrain from speaking that might cause further harm or that might be unconstructive, or when you're speaking from a place that doesn't yet like have any additional contribution to make. So it's as much refraining from speech as it is speaking up and using your voice, which is also a big part of it. I think, if we're thinking about applications in modern times, using right speech might be a way of speaking out against injustice.
Yes. Is it spoken at the right time? So it may be absolutely accurate, but is this the time to say it?
Right. And can you do it with kindness?
That's right. Can you do it with kindness, both in terms of delivery, so spoken affectionately to the person, and also with actual goodwill? Like passive-aggressive behavior of thoughts, I find sometimes ill will can hide under like, well, it's true.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Totally. Oh, is there slight ill will here?
Like, okay, that is true, but ouch. Yeah.
Yes. And spoken in truth, for instance, there was one example where I formulated an answer in my mind to an email and was feeling quite self-righteous. And then, but then this pointer, spoken in truth, like what is actually true in my experience? What is it actually true?
Well, I think this segues in nicely to right action, which is the next one, right? Because also what we're thinking about when we speak, we're taking action, right? If we're engaging another person, that is a kind of action. And an important part of right action is to not be harmful to others. So we can use our speech to harm others. And then, of course, we can be harmful in other ways by killing other beings and that sort of thing as well. I think it's a useful kind of segue. Speech is, as we're thinking about the ways in which speech can be harmful. Well, right action has a lot to say about not doing harmful things. So there's a great example of some of this in a book called Black and Buddhist, which I really recommend to everyone. And the editors are Cheryl Giles and Pamela Ayoyatunde. And they do a nice introduction where they talk about the Eightfold Path as it relates to kind of social justice work. One point they make under right speech is really this idea of right communication. They talk about, right, it's not just speaking, but not speaking, as we were saying. But the importance of where right view fits in, that if you are coming from a place of duality in your social justice action, then you're going to be really strongly us versus them. And we see this in politics regardless of where you are, your political views. It's just a very divided time with very extreme views and very strong us versus them thinking across all manner of ideas and topics and issues. So when we're coming from this very dualistic place of us versus them, wherever us is, then that's not going to lead to right speech or right action. Even if you are trying really hard to engage with this cause, you're more likely to do something that's going to be harmful or unhelpful to your cause because you're going to be coming from this place of duality. So it's difficult to figure out how to engage the world with right speech and right action and to maintain that view of non-duality. But that's also the place where the most effective action can come from. So I really like that the way that they talk about the connections between these. And I wanted to share that example because it ties us back to the ways in which these all kind of commingle and relate and how easy it can be with right speech or action to come from this dualistic place.
It's a very good example of how these things sort of almost like they're intersecting.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So with right action, it's about not harming other beings, respecting life more generally. So again, we don't want to just like, okay, don't kill people, but also, hey, maybe like don't eat meat, maybe if you can not eat meat or eat less meat or, whatever feels right in your world. That's one way in which it's been traditionally interpreted. But also, like, again, can we just respect life? Are there ways to respect the lives of the beings around us, whether it's our neighbors or the squirrels in our yard or the bugs in our basement, can we treat those lives with respect somehow? So that's like, I feel like maybe a higher bar than just don't kill them. Oh, yeah.
Which also reminds me, these concepts can be, I think, expanded to include, for example, respecting life can also include respecting the life force in us, in others, which relates to their fundamental human needs and desires. So that would be also not judging them and not trying to prevent them from living their lives in accordance with. I mean, it requires a lot of discernment, but.
Yeah, right. I like that, respecting the life force in ourselves and all beings and trying to encourage thriving and trying to encourage a full flowering of that being, a full expression of that life.
Yes.
Whether it's our own in this lifetime or others.
I recently attended a lecture on Nietzsche. One of the major points Nietzsche had apparently was that Western culture had become too abstract, too cognitive, and split into sort of the cognitive and the animal part. Sort of, he called them the Apollonian and Dionysian. So not denying our humanity.
So the third in this area is right livelihood, which we can think of broadly as one which allows us the capacity to express the other items on the Eightfold Path, perhaps, right? So if we engage in a livelihood that encourages us to, or that allows us to engage right action, right speech, if we feel like we can bring our view of non-duality, our view of impermanence, our intention to benefit all beings, what kind of work might we find our way into? What kind of livelihood can we engage in that's ethical, compassionate, does not cause further harm on this planet? That can be difficult to sort of square that circle in modern times. But we could start by minimizing the harm that we cause through our work and start to move from there, maybe. And also how we relate in the midst of the work that we're doing as well. How do we relate to our colleagues or...
Right. In the Buddhist teachings, that distinction is made between guidance for nuns and monks and guidance for householders. There's a lot of information, though, and guidance about what could lead to the right livelihood for householders as well. There's a famous sentence that talks about don't trade in weapons in living beings, meat, intoxicants, and poisons. But the teachings go far deeper into it. So, for instance, the proper use of wealth,
Mm-hmm.
avoiding dissipation of wealth, budgeting.
Uh-huh. Also, how you manage your wealth.
Exactly.
I like that. Yeah.
There's a lot of practical information that can help us think through our lives. Most of us are not working as butchers or we're not involved in human slavery.
Right.
Although a pair of jeans we buy
Mm-hmm.
may have been produced,
Or a phone.
or a telephone, right? Exactly. It's not so much like, oh well, I'm not a butcher, so I don't have to worry about it.
I will also maybe chime in here around that part that there are parts of the world where Buddhists have eaten meat and have had to eat meat and have engaged with that practice in a way that, was attempting to engage in right action, in terms of showing respect for life, even, when they had to take it in order to feed themselves. So just maybe it's worth noting that there. But for us, probably most listeners here, something worth being thoughtful about in terms of, how we relate to the meat that we eat if we eat meat, and also, the conditions in which our food is harvested, even if it isn't meat, and the ways in which our spending habits do or don't express our ethics, and to see what it might be like to get more in alignment there. It gets very easy to get perfectionistic about this, and I wouldn't want to encourage that in people, but I think there's a place to think like, well, could I do a little more, a little different or something? Could I change something that would then feel better for me in these areas?
Right. And an illustration of how the different spokes contribute to each other. In the discussion of the cultivation of right livelihood, there's also discussion of, for instance, mindfulness of the body. Because as we go about our day doing our work, if we are present in our body and present with the present time reality, as opposed to pre-programmed views of the world, perhaps, we're much more likely to practice right livelihood. And similarly, in terms of the selfing, seeing ourselves and others as part of a continuum, as part of a whole, as opposed to what's mine is mine, I'm going to take it away from you kind of approach. So that also intersects with the whole idea of right livelihood.
So the next three, the last three, are listed in this category of mental disciplines, and they involve right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. We can think of right effort as this, if anyone's received meditation instructions that talk about going like not too tight and not too loose in your meditation, so you're not being like super rigid and perfectionistic and like really harsh and stern with yourself. I'm going to get this right, but also where you're not like so lazy and whatever about your practice that you're kind of like dozing off and don't really care and like forget you're meditating most of the time. There's some kind of sweet spot in the middle there, which is a right effort. So making a kind of consistent effort to engage with the practice of meditation, to engage with, these other items on the Eightfold Path, and finding this middle way between like overdoing it and checking out.
And also, perfectionism is danger.
I feel like there's a lot of wrong effort or unwise effort that goes on in modern society, at least in, sort of Western cultures, with a focus on intense productivity and like this sort of like hyper engaged directed action. It's just sort of can very easily go, be like, or you have a lot of effort, but it's kind of unskillful and like clunky and like actually not helpful to you. And often, not everyone else either.
Wasteful, that can
Right.
stress. It's a very rich topic of discussion, showing effort towards wholesome behaviors and practices and renouncing, staying away from unwholesome ones that create suffering.
And again, kind of connecting these with others, like the right effort involves like you're coming from a certain view and have a certain benefit that you're trying to achieve, like a certain intention to benefit others, like, and so your effort is coming from this different place, than this like very dualistic and self-serving kind of quality.
And finding ways to inspire ourselves in the right way, not giving into discouragement.
Even though I'm saying a lot of us overdo it, I also think it's easy to kind of float along and not make a deliberate effort at times in certain areas of our life too. Just kind of muddle through, or like not, like kind of be aware we're not really where we want to be or getting what we need or whatever to like, fully express ourselves in this world or whatever it is. But, we kind of just don't engage in the effort, even as we might be putting in too much effort in other areas. So I think there's some skillful exploration of this to figure out what right effort can look like for each of us individually, given our kind of maybe personal settings, like our factory settings, in various areas related to effort. And so mindfulness and concentration are our last two. I connect them somewhat in that I feel like they're more focused on kind of meditative states of mind, even though, of course, we can be mindful about all manner of activities. So this is a place where mindfulness shows up, right? This word is very popular these days and has perhaps come to mean a lot of unrelated things, depending on who you're talking to. But here, we're talking about right mindfulness in the sense of present moment, kind of awareness, attentiveness, non-judgmental, sort of accepting of what arises. Yeah.
And concentration more in terms of being able to focus. It's interesting that when we practice mindfulness meditation, there's a piece where we're actually practicing concentration. When we're returning to our breath, for instance, we're actually practicing concentration. We're growing that muscle. And then once we have the required concentration in the moment, then that makes it much easier for us to be mindful by being able to be non-judgmental, having meta-awareness of our awareness. Where's my mind? What habit am I engaging in? What's going on? What's actually going on? As opposed to getting caught up in thought. Concentration allows us to take hold of the instrument, as it were.
Right. Yeah. I think, the practices of mindfulness have become so varied and all over the place that there can be some real imprecision to it that's confusing. So here we're looking at mindfulness as like present moment awareness to what is arising. So for instance, when you're meditating, you might be aware of the feeling of the sun warming your back if the sun is shining on you while you're sitting. Or you might be, as you're saying, have a meta awareness of what you're thinking about. Like, I'm sitting here thinking about work. Like some part of you breaks through with mindfulness and has this moment of like, I am now aware. I'm sitting here on the cushion, but what I am doing is thinking about work. Right. So it can be aware of thinking, aware of body sensations. Also, just like if you're sitting outside and you notice a car drive by and you kind of are just noticing, right? Or you're, part of a group of people and you're kind of navigating that interpersonal space, like, who needs a little more attention or who has, a wider personal space margin, right? Or what do I need to do when I'm walking down the street so I don't bump into this person, or just all of those kind of kinesthetic, sensory sort of awareness is another piece of that. So we can bring mindfulness, obviously to our meditation practice, but really any point in life, we can become more sort of aware of the experience as it's arising. And then concentration are those more deliberate practices of trying to train the mind to focus on something, to create a certain state of mind and stay there, like to have a certain amount of mental stability, focusing on the breath, focusing on a mantra, the practices that lead to kind of deeper states of meditative kind of absorption. Those practices are more in the right concentration realm.
And recently I've come across an article that was titled The Sisters of Mindfulness: Forgiveness, Gratitude, Loving Kindness, Compassion, Acceptance. Sometimes these sisters are folded into mindfulness. So we come across them in a mindfulness context, or they discuss in a mindfulness context, but they are distinct and they support each other. As well as the practice of joy, for instance, that sometimes gets left out of the understanding, because the emphasis on suffering can make people think this is sort of a gray, gloomy view of the world. But there's actually a lot of discussion also of the importance of cultivating, experiencing joy and pleasant states, which actually are very practically helpful in concentration and mindfulness. And the various sisters of mindfulness actually end up feeling quite good, like compassion, forgiveness.
Thank you. That's great. I love the Sisters of Mindfulness. That's great. So we will put together a show notes page for this episode and put some links to some of these things that we've been quoting here, like the Sisters of Mindfulness, perhaps among other resources. So be sure to go to our Noble Mind podcast website and hit the show notes page for this episode to get some of those goodies. And we hope that you have found this exploration of the Four Noble Truths, this 4-episode series, really useful for you all. And we've covered 8 things in this episode, all of which deserve a deeper dive unto themselves. But hopefully this was a nice kind of starter for you or reminder for you about the noble Eightfold Path. Thank you all for listening. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.